Hello, good evening. So thankful to see you and thankful for a good night already that we've been able to be together, but look forward to spending time in the Word of God. Thank you for choosing to be here. We might get to this tonight, even though we're down a few families, I think, but we've been mentioning this exercise that when we think about our children and each of our child, let's think about, based on the Word of God and from what God would have us to do to raise children, where do we see our children in 10 years, 15 years, however long it is until they leave home? Where do we want them to be based on what God charges us with and gives us in His Word? Are we thinking toward that end of kind of passing them off to responsibility? And we might get to that at the close of the lesson tonight, but I'm guessing more likely it'll be first thing next week. So be working on that, thinking about that. We won't do anything publicly with it. But be thinking on that and putting some pen to paper at this stage and thinking about that through Scripture. Denny's checking on our class teachers. We got Mike in here as a grill master. Maybe some others that are kind of known for proficiency with the grill. After you kind of have spent several years grilling, y'all know, anybody familiar kind of with the concept of two-zone cooking, two-zone setup when you set up your grill? There in the middle you see the approach on a charcoal kettle grill where you've got charcoal off to one side, and then you've got, this in this case is a pan, maybe a pan of water. Some people go really the extra mile and put their baked beans on the indirect side and let that Boston Bud or whatever fat drip into the baked beans. That's a little extra step that I'm not willing to take for my cholesterol. But the idea is that even within one set environment, you can have high heat where the charcoals are, and then over on the other side of the grill, it's still hot enough to cook, but not near as hot as if you were over the coals. So you see that set up with a gas grill. It's real easy with a gas grill because of the knobs. See it again, just kind of the cross-section view on the bottom right. So indirect cooking, direct cooking, two-zone cooking. How do you go about deciding which one to use, though? What kind of questions, what kind of thinking goes into deciding, all right, I set my grill up this way, I've got my charcoals to one side. How do you decide? Denny's back here with us. Any grilling thoughts between indirect and direct heat, Denny? Is it any wonder that I struggle with slim size shirts if I'm always talking about cooking and food and stuff and my illustrations? Any observations, Denny? Okay. Well, that's. Okay, well that's good feedback too. I might need to start over. When it comes to setting up your grill, you can set up your charcoal on one side, and right above those coals, it's going to be super hot. You can't keep your hand over it for long at all. But over on the other side, it may be dramatically cooler, okay? You can do that on a gas grill. You can do that with charcoal just the same. And so you've got what's called indirect and direct heat cooking, okay? How would you go about deciding which side of the grill to use if you've got that set up? Yeah, that's great. That's great. What? Yeah, those are the two things. How do you want it? Where's the end result? And what's it made of? What's on the inside, right? Might cook what? A flank steak, something real thin on the high heat side. Something extremely thick like a Boston Bud or a brisket you cook on the low heat side for a long time. But a normal size piece of meat, steak, hamburger, piece of chicken, you need what? You need kind of both, right? You need a few seconds, maybe a few minutes max to get some crispy skin, to get the outside seared. But you need a little longer, maybe sometimes much longer, on that lower heat side to cook it slower, okay? So as we talk about raising children, we need a combination of both low and slow, but also high heat. We need some intense heat sometimes as we parent. It's just necessary because we're focusing and funneling those boundaries and that behavior. Two factors are going to be, where are we going to end up with this, and what's it like on the inside? What's the temperament of the inside? One thing that I hadn't thought about until today is, I don't know how many times I've told Amanda over the past couple of years that maybe the best investment we've had in terms of me learning to kind of grill a little better is a what? A what? No, grilling, sorry. I'm striking out of my questions tonight. A thermometer, right? A digital thermometer helps you know what's on the inside of the meat and what the environment is that you're cooking in. If we're just eyeballing it, you're at risk of going too far or not going far enough with the temperature. But if you're constantly assessing what's happening, then you can make adjustments as needed. So, quickly, parenting, we need to set the environment. We need a constant environment of discipline, teaching, instruction, pointing in the right direction. Sometimes when they cross those boundaries, we need correction and high heat. There needs to be enough of a consequence to pull them back into the boundary. But our factors have to be, where are they headed and how's their heart? What's on the inside? And we need to constantly be, way back when we started, we need to constantly be listening and spending time with and assessing their disposition, not just trying to observe it kind of from the outside. Are we actively assessing the temperature of their hearts? Okay? So that's where we want to aim our talk, our continued discussion tonight about correction and consequences. The big picture is discipline, instruction of the Lord. And that involves several things. The biggest chunk of that is just how we live day to day, how we organize and plan our day with Him. Along the way, we're going to have positive teaching moments. We're going to have some negative teaching moments need to happen. And then the smallest sliver, in theory, should be those times the boundaries are crossed. What will we do to correct and instill some consequences in just the right amount of pain such that causes them to decide, to choose on their own to come back? And so that's what we're talking about tonight, continuing it from last week. We introduced from Hebrews chapter 12, where he's kind of making a transition. He's told them, keep your eyes on Jesus, verses 1 and 2, and then 3. And then he says, verse 4, I know it's cost you something already. But in your resisting, you're staying faithful, you're enduring persecution, you've not yet had to suffer till death. It's kind of a nice way of him saying it's probably going to get worse. But then he begins to outline how this all fits into the Lord's plan to help them grow stronger, which is through the Lord allowing them to suffer such that it makes them stronger. And to do that, he talks about discipline and begins by quoting from Proverbs 3, 11 and 12. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline. Well, verse 5, before he quotes from Proverbs 3 even, he says, have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? So have you forgotten it? You should have already known it. You should remember it. And he calls it an exhortation. It's not just meant to be corrective. It's meant to build them up, to exhort them, to encourage them. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastises every son whom he receives. So that's the quotation from Proverbs 3. And you'll see there that it's inseparable connection between love and discipline. Why do you discipline your children? Just to exercise authority, just to have power in your own mind, just to look good? Or is it actually in their best interest to love them? If we're parenting like the Father, like our Heavenly Father treats us, it means we do it out of love. We do it for the sake of loving and investing in them. Now, we said last week that he quotes from Proverbs 3, and we issued a challenge that maybe we should follow in the steps of the Hebrew writer and see what discipline texts or verses come from the book of Proverbs. Anyone able to unearth any jewels of discipline from the book of Proverbs? It's not always the word discipline. It can be several ways of describing it. But anybody take us up on that assignment to search Proverbs for verses about corrective discipline? Our Bible reading was supposed to be one of those, but I typed a 0 for Proverbs 20 instead of Proverbs 29. That one applied decently at the end of it about father and mother, cursing father and mother. Told Amanda that was dangerous when you get to Proverbs sometimes to have a typo. Anybody have discipline, correction, chastising Proverbs from last week or since last week? Any brave souls?
Just looking at Proverbs 1, verse 8, hear my son, your father's instruction, forsake not your mother's teaching, for they are a graceful garland for your head and hindrance for your neck.
Okay, so that's directly instruction and teaching, kind of previewing and setting up the whole book of Proverbs even. These various instructions, don't neglect them and even wear them. View them as something that's special and stays with you. Okay, that's good. It's a good start. Is it biblical to directly to spank our children? It's kind of come under fire the past couple of decades. Proverbs is the only book, to my knowledge, really where that is directly addressed by the wording. Yeah, that's kind of how we've summarized a lot of the teaching in Proverbs. Spare the rod, spoil the child.
Proverbs 29 and 15 says, the rod and
Yeah.
reproof give wisdom, but a child left unto himself will shame to his mother.
That's right. Proverbs 29 has a whole section on these things. So Mr. Joy opened us up with that one. I'll put the rest of it on the screen for you. The rod and reproof give wisdom. How are we going to enforce wisdom? How are we going to enforce the teaching? Sometimes it demands rod, reproof, to bring us back across into the right boundaries when we've crossed them. What's the opposite? What's the contrast to the rod and reproof? A child left to himself. And the result is he'll bring shame to his mother, bring shame to his family. We're guilty probably of the shame part, right? Can you believe so-and-so lets their kids act that way? I mean, we get how that works, right? Proverbs writer says, if you just leave them onto themselves, their own devices, there's no correction at all, eventually it creates a mess. And they were big in terms of honor and perception, and is almost currency way back then in those cultures. But rest of Proverbs 29. Let's look at a few other things while we're here. Discipline your son and he will give you rest. How exhausting is it to have rebellious children? How exhausting is it to worry, to wonder, what are they getting into? It will give you, yeah.
Proverbs 15 and 5 says, a fool despises his father's instruction.
Okay. That's good.
Receives reproof is prudent.
Is prudent, is wise, is thoughtful. Yep. I didn't have that one on my list. Proverbs 15:5, if you're keeping a list on a piece of paper there or on your phone or something. Proverbs 15:5, you said, Roger? It's foolish to reject father's discipline. All right, 18. We'll come back to verse 18 shortly. But where there is no prophetic vision, the people cast off restraint. So you see a clear explaining or casting of vision. You see keeping restraint, keeping the law. With a clear explanation, you see the need for restraining even with the vision. But that leads to blessings that come when we keep the law. If we abandon prophetic vision, if we abandon restraint, then we will not have children, or we will not ourselves, in our own cases, keep the law. Verse 19, by mere words, a servant is not disciplined. For though he understands, he will not respond. We've talked about this one a couple of weeks ago when we talked about those trust breakers. That if we just threaten, if we just say, I'm going to do this, or you're in trouble, or it's only verbal, typically that's a good way to get them to put it off and to call our bluff and just to keep kind of toying with us. Action is far more important than words. In verse 20, you see a man who's hasty in his words, there's more hope for a fool than him. So you see the hasty parent in verse 19, and there's more hope for a fool than for him. So several in Proverbs 29, a whole paragraph essentially there. Do you have another one, Roger?
I was just looking at one that deals with rebuke.
Okay, yeah,
Would be,
sure, yeah,
says open rebuke.
yeah,
Now, we can understand
that's good.
this as far
Yeah.
as between friends
Yeah,
or in children.
yeah,
Especially, but notice what it says, open rebuke is better than love carefully concealed.
yeah,
In other words, we
Yeah.
love somebody so much, we don't say anything to them, or we
Right.
love them enough that we correct them.
yeah, that's it. That's great. Great thought. Open rebuke is better than secret love. Secret
And love carefully concealed.
love carefully concealed. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, a lot of time, I mean, it's easy for us as parents to think, I really need to say something. I really need to correct them. I really need to stop that behavior, but I want them to still love me. I want them to still like me. But if we know rebuke is necessary, it's actually the loving thing to do that and to keep them away from potential harm.
If you start when they're young enough, that's not that big of a breaking heart when they get to allow
Right, yeah. Yep.
Another one that goes along with that one is from Proverbs 28:23 says, he who rebukes a man will find more favor afterwards than he who flatters with a tongue.
Yeah, that's good.
Think about how much more
Yeah,
we appreciate our parents and
Yeah.
other things later on.
right.
And
Yeah,
the rebuke and the
Right.
correction that we got rather than
yep. That is good. Yeah, how much smarter they get the older we got. Yep. Absolutely. All right, a few that I've got on the screen. Proverbs 13:24, whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him. See, adding the concept of diligent there reminds us it takes commitment, it takes effort, it takes learning ourselves. It's not just helping them learn. We have to remain diligent along with them because it's difficult to keep that focus and to know when to rebuke, to when to correct, all those kind of things. Proverbs 10, verse 13, on the lips of him who has understanding, wisdom is found, but a rod is for the back of him who lacks sense. There's a time and a place to where that physical correction is needed to get us back into seeking wisdom and doing the right thing. 22, verse 15. Yes. Ah, yeah. Yeah. Right. You remember how old, like, about what age you're talking about there? Yeah, that's an interesting observation. I think we'll get to that in a list we've got. Yeah. Right. Yeah, there becomes a time and a stage of maturity where you pleasing your parents, honoring them, keeping, this vision they have for you, that is far more important to you. And so it's more painful than just a momentary spanking. And I got a great story that Amanda loves to tell, we love to tell, from somebody else, not our lives. But, we need to remember that physical spanking has a shelf life, right? And there becomes some deeper, more effective ways the older they get. And we need to harness that for their best interest, so absolutely. Yes. Some what? Yes, right. Right. Yes, that's it. Yeah. Yeah. What's most costly to them. Yeah. Absolutely. And so that, we've talked about Proverbs 22:6, train up the child in the way he should go. It's going to involve some different methods for depending on the child. Not only their age, but also their background, their personality, their interest, those kind of things.
But you know, Joey, what
Yes? Go ahead.
in my years of
Yeah.
teaching is the respect. There's no,
Yeah.
respect is not being taught.
Right.
It's not being taught at
Yeah.
home,
Right.
the kids, and at the same time,
Yeah.
they don't care, if I say, you're gonna have to go to the office.
Right. Yeah.
I'm not afraid of them.
Right. Yep.
And when I was in school, and most of us were, we got in trouble at school, we didn't want those.
Right. Yeah.
But it's always the teacher that's wrong in this family.
Right. Yep. Yep. That's the current we have to push back on. It might seem slow and be slow, but the more we tackle what we've got to do, the better we can do at it. And it's just a reflection of these principles because they don't learn respect in the home, and probably because they have plenty of parents who spank them or withhold from them or abuse them or whatever. See, it's gas to a fire. Without that environment of respect and trust, but then you pull this punishment stuff in, then it becomes a nightmare. And those kids don't respect authority because their authority figures are disrespectful. And that is tough, very tough. But maybe, if we can reach this generation of kids and they can see a better way and learn a better way, then that's where we can begin to change the tide. I like Proverbs 20, verse 30. Blows that wound cleanse away evil. It's kind of a wordplay, right? Blows that hurt heal. Strokes make clean the innermost parts. There is a way to correct from the outside, externally, that will influence us internally. That should be our aim. We have to change some circumstances to tighten the screws sometimes such that from the inside out, behavior wants to change. And then two more on my list, Proverbs 23, 13 and 14. Do not withhold discipline from a child. I mean, how plain is this, and how much do we need to remember this, parents? If you strike him with a rod, he will not die. It's not abuse to spank them on their bottoms or the back of their leg. He's going to survive. She's going to survive. Verse 14, if you strike him with the rod, you will save his soul from Sheol. Sheol is the pit of the dead, is what they called that in the Hebrew language and culture. So if you strike him, he won't die. If you strike him, you will save his soul from death. And so there's a necessary component. Remember, it's not all of parenting, but we better be firm and confident in knowing that this is a vital part of what we are doing. And then verse 18 of chapter 19, discipline your son, for there is hope. If we ever think it's hopeless, if we ever think, well, that's just the way they are, then it's futile. We discipline because there is hope. And that needs to come across when we sit down and talk with them and when we have those conversations with them afterward. And we're disciplined because we love you and because there is a better way, because there is hope, because there is a path for wisdom and righteousness. That's why there has to be consequences to funnel us and focus us in that direction.
This one creates a fear, a loving fear.
Right, yeah. Reverent fear, submissive fear, yeah. Yeah.
Do something wrong.
Right. That's right.
Joey, I never
Yes.
forget, in this age, you've got a lot of grandparents raising children. And
Yeah.
I'm sure
That's tough, yeah.
A few years ago, they were a lady, and I'm sure it's her grandchildren, whether in the store. They had two buggies, and they were running from one side of the store across in front of the meat market, hollering, carrying on, She was as loud as they were, hollering at them.
Yep.
Couldn't get them to stop, and I looked at her, I said, ma'am, I've got a belt here if you need to use it, and if Luke's could have killed, I've been
Yeah. Yeah, you wonder where they learned to holler, right? They learned it from her, and she was unwilling to just apply some corrective action. Yep. 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 That's right. Quickly from Hebrews 12, I want to get to a list of things but we need to think about the future more than just the present. When we think about corrective discipline, are we focusing on what they're becoming? That's the bigger picture than more than just this moment. And it's hard because crying and whining and being defiant, all those things naturally ramp up the emotions for us, and we want to solve the emotions of the moment. But we have to have thought about some things going into it and decided a game plan going into it such that we can make the wisest and best decisions for the long term more than just easing the anxiety of the moment. Okay? Thinking about the present only is a good way to let emotions take over and be ineffective. What is painful now for both parties? It's not easy for us to discipline, but the idea is that small amounts of intentional, pointed, focused pain right now will lead to them growing into pleasant fruit, peaceful fruit. And holiness and righteousness of character must always be our aim. God does it so that we may share in His holiness. What if we would adopt that way of thinking for our own homes, that we're directing, correcting, such that we all work with God into His holiness. And then verse 11 is interesting because we've talked about training up and bringing up. He's talking about discipline. Later, discipline yields peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. We train up, build up. Painful, at times, discipline is necessary for that training process. Okay? So training is about doing the right thing, being sure that we never reward the wrong thing, and then allowing consequences to happen when the wrong thing is done. Remember Ephesians 6, verse 1, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Our system of correction needs to be built on what is right, what is wrong. We don't reward wrong. They're deceptive and they lie when they're 4 years old, and we laugh at how cute it was that they cut their eyes over and got one past us. That's rewarding wrong. But then also, we allow consequences when wrong happens. Sometimes, especially the younger they are, we are the source of those consequences. The older they get, the more we need to be aware of natural, realistic consequences to their actions. It hurts to hurt, but it's not bad to hurt. Hebrews 12 says there's actually growth that happens when we hurt in the right way from the right sources. And so when we talk about those consequences, we need a combination of those that are natural and the ones that we put into place. I wish we could get through all this in time tonight, but we'll try. Couple of practical things to work through as much as we can. Thinking about corrective discipline, we need to be sure that we think about it in terms of when clear boundaries are crossed. God gave Adam and Eve the garden, and He gave them one rule. He didn't give them a long list. Eat of any tree, positive, except this tree. One negative rule. It was clear. The consequences were clear. So when they broke it, He could go back to a clear communication of the rule and a clear communication of the consequence. It was concise. It was understandable. It was not God giving payback. It was not God taking it as revenge. Well, you didn't respect me, so now I have to punish you. It was God saying, this is in your best interest. Here's the boundary. You broke it. Now, here's the consequence. And so we need to be careful just in thinking, am I clear? Am I clear? And I need to be thinking about clarity on the front end before, but then also clarity on the follow-up. Okay? Miss Kathy talked about that hug that her dad would give him after the punishment and the correction. That's incredibly important. And they are often very receptive to that because their will has been brought into submission, right? Well, we need to be clear. Here's why we had to do this. Because a clear boundary was broken. It's not just, I didn't whip out the switch, or I didn't spank you because my feelings were hurt. But because there was a boundary that's there in your best interest, and we crossed it, and so here's the consequence. So clarity will make up for so many other of our struggles if we will be clear with the boundaries, don't overrule them to death, or give them too many rules. And then when we do give one, we better be sure we're consistent and follow through. All right, number two, kind of connected to that, remove our emotions from it as much as possible. Our authority needs to be from God giving us that authority, not from our emotional response. Okay? Way back, James 1, let every man be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. It's easy to let that process build. But our authority doesn't come from intimidation, from having a mean face, just from getting louder. We can structure our environment and our relationship such that it comes from the fact that this is our house. And God's given me to your care, or given you into my care. So this is the authority we have as parents. These are the boundaries we're setting up. Here are the consequences when they don't happen. And the more we can remain calm, the better it'll be received in the long run. Be swift, be fair, be consistent. If we are emotional, it'll kind of interact and interfere with, block those things. One test, I read one guy suggested, am I concerned with obedience on issues that I am unemotional about? Let's say you've got a dad who never was really all that into school, didn't really care about homework. So he doesn't think his kid has to do that much homework. I really don't care. I'm not that, as long as they kind of do their best, do well in school, I'm fine. I'm not going to be a stickler about homework. And a child's been told, do your homework. Will dad enforce that obedience to that issue that he's not really all that emotionally invested in for the sake of enforcing obedience? See, it's not tied to the issue. It's not tied to something that's close to our hearts. Instead, it's the pointing them toward a path of obedience and submission instead of something that's personal, if you will. And then James Dobson, Focus on the Family, talks about, he has a paragraph where he says, inappropriate use of anger is the most common and the most costly attempt to try to discipline and control children. Let me find the rest of this. I didn't have room to put it all up there. It's the least effective, it's inappropriate, and it's maybe the most costly. He says, and yet, most adults rely on it the most to try to secure cooperation. And he says elsewhere that a lot of times we kind of buy into the cycle because we think it takes anger to get them to whip themselves into shape. He said, but what you'll notice in us as parents is that it usually takes us getting angry before we do something about it. See, we're on this continuum and we're talking, and then we finally act because our emotions are finally stoked up strong enough. And we think our child's responding to the anger, but they're really responding to the action. Oh, he meant it enough to actually walk across the room now? Okay, yeah, I'll calm down. And we think, well, I had to get angry to get him. And so we fuel it, and we can start with the action quickly and be calm, be in control of our emotions, and can often cut that cycle off before it ever really gets out of hand. He tells kind of funny illustration to talk about this. James Dobson does. He says, imagine you're going blatantly over the speed limit, 65 and a 25. And you drive by a street corner, and there is a police officer standing on the street corner, no car, no badge, no gun, no ticket book. And as you drive by, he's waving his hands and he's screaming at you and he's stomping and he's red-faced and he is as mad and angry as he can be at you. We'll fly right by and we'll laugh as we do it because what? He has no ability to enforce that rule we're clearly breaking. But if we recreate the same scenario, he pulls us over in his patrol car, he gets out with his badge, his gun, his ticket book, his hat on. We're shaking to death in the car, right? He knocks on the window. Yes, sir. We're polite. It's his authority and his exercise of that government-given authority that gives us pause, not his emotions. And so as we think about parenting and we think about those difficult, often emotional moments of when boundaries are crossed, will we respond with calm, but a calm enforcement of boundaries as opposed to an amped up, angry, emotional avoiding of enforcing it as long as we can. Putting it off. Well, they're going to call our bluff as long as we put it off. And so for me, I think about this list. That's probably the biggest one, I struggle with at the moment, is just allowing them to cause me to get upset. And let's just be swift and decide ahead of time and just act, and then stay involved in them and engaged with them emotionally. All right? Anything to add on those 2 points? Whew.
I think it's quite unfair to discipline a child if you do not have clear boundaries.
Yes.
And I think no matter the age, the boundary needs to be clear
Yes.
and at the level of their understanding.
Yes.
And your tolerance level versus your spouse's tolerance level
Yes.
is different. But until children understand established boundaries,
Right.
they will not respond to discipline.
Right. Yep.
That's why.
Yeah, that's what Teresa was talking about. Yeah. Yep.
And
Yep.
that's because the boundaries have always been wherever they put them.
Yep. Yep.
Where you have the
Right.
opposite of the parents that now decide
Yes.
your child never does anything wrong.
Yep. Yep. And it starts from before they're even verbal. I mean, you can have a 6-month-old who understands some of these principles, and we don't need to be spanking 6-month-olds, but they can hear and they can respond in such a way that we can still kind of correct, and we can still understand when they're trying to cross versus when they are being respectful. And that needs to be where our wisdom and our constant thinking ahead is coming into play. Have I communicated it clearly? And once I have, am I following through with confidence? It takes both sides. And if we let one of those slide, then it begins to all fall apart. Yeah. I think we probably suffer a lot because we're not clear enough on the front end. We just don't. Here's the rule. Here's the expectation. Here's the consequence. All right. Anything else? Thank you for that. We'll pick up with 4 more reminders that shouldn't be as involved next week. And then we will pass the word around. We'll announce it Sunday, but we'll introduce and let you begin the practice with those lists of qualities that we want our children to be when they are adults. And then time permitting, we may introduce raising children in this digital age, okay? So technology, children, and how difficult that can be, but yet how possible it is for us to please the Lord in that regard. Thank you for your reading and for your comments.